the City Rev Life Podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy. We've got Robey Barnes with us. We've been in our series talking about empathy. In our previous episode, we started the discussion on just how to begin putting empathy in a more practical standpoint.
Sure.
We started off talking about listening. Today, we're going to be talking about validation and the connection between empathy and validation. But before we make the connection, what do we mean by validation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a key practice of empathy. And this is a skill that I think we fumble a lot. And to really figure this out, it's very powerful. It's important. And I think even though sometimes we fumble this, we've all been in conversations where we have felt the absence of this when we needed it. And so exactly how to always employ it is challenging, but I think we can all appreciate when we've been looking for validation and not gotten it. But let's define what we mean by validation. And I'm just going to read a quote by a psychiatrist about validation. It was this: communicating to someone that her or his responses make sense and are understandable within her or his current life context or situation. So in other words, it's basically demonstrating to someone that your reaction or emotion or perspective on what you're going through is understandable. Now, what's key about that is that's not necessarily agreeing with that. It's not necessarily affirming. It's affirming it as valid, not necessarily affirming it as right and correct. And that's the link. Sometimes we're hesitant. That's the important distinction. Sometimes we are hesitant to offer validation because we don't want to affirm it as correct. So, for example, if I was driving recklessly because or speeding because I really wanted to get to my son's soccer game or my daughter's violin concert or whatever it is, and I'm sharing that with you, Jeremy, that doesn't excuse driving recklessly or speeding. And I might tell that story to you. I got a ticket and I was driving fast just because I really so badly wanted to get to the game and I had missed the last one. You could say, man, I totally get that. I know I've been in a place where I have driven, I'd probably have felt the same way. You validating and entering into that is not saying, and it's okay. And how dare them give you a speeding ticket? They should change the law, because you can validate my experience as a fellow human without saying, and you were right in that. That's the difference. And sometimes validation is helpful because it makes me feel understood and known. And sometimes that's all that's needed in a conversation. But sometimes that is actually an important part of getting to the place where you could say, hey, and while I probably would have done the same thing, I think we both know that's not a good practice, to do, if needed. Now, you probably knew that I knew that, but there's sometimes a validation is important, leading to telling someone a tough truth. So a couple things. Validation is communicating that someone's reaction or someone's emotions or someone's actions are understandable. It's kind of entering into that. And it's not necessarily agreeing with the person. And it's also, validation is not necessarily avoiding telling them the truth, even a hard truth. Validation might be a step towards correction, although that's not necessarily always needed. So validation there's a nuance to validation, but we want to learn this skill because this is really, really important.
So it's not affirming what they're saying or agreeing with what they're saying, but more so prioritizing that they're understood in whatever it is that they're expressing.
Yeah, it's basically, I get you. Okay. I can appreciate why you feel the way you feel.
Okay.
I can understand why you did what you did. Like if I was in your shoes, I probably would feel similar.
What would you say are some of the things that take place in the mind and heart of a person who's being validated?
I think they feel understood. I think they feel not alone.
Okay.
And I think that's the power of validation, is that it's that they feel they don't feel alone. They don't, and I think they feel understood. So there's that relational intimacy that's happening, but it's also important because I think that they don't feel judged. Yeah. And I think it's not me. It's me being like human to human, because you know that I'm flawed. I don't have to pretend I'm not flawed because you know that I'm flawed. The gospel gives me permission to own it. I'm flawed. What makes me great is not how flawless I am. What makes me great is the flawless Christ took my flaws on him and paid for them, and I'm not defined by them anymore. And so the what's important about empathy is that it's the power of it. I'm understood. I don't feel alone, and I don't feel judged. Self-righteousness distances myself. Like it's like shunning. I'm not shunning someone. I'm coming to them. You can't validate without putting aside self-righteousness. Mm-hmm. Jesus was super clear about this. He was super clear on what about truth and about sin and godliness, but he also told us not to judge each other. And he gave a very clear illustration. He says, don't try and get the speck out of your brother's eye when you have a plank in your eye. And so a lot of times what's keeping me back from at least saying, hey, I don't need to say it like this, but what's happening in my mind is I don't necessarily agree with that, but I get that. I get that. Why? Because the only reason I would say, well, how dare you, is because I've got a plank in my eye and I'm not actually stopping to think of, I probably would have done the same thing in that situation. If not that situation, I've done something really similar in other situations. Or maybe I just totally would never do what you did, but I would do way worse things in other situations than you would do. Validation is just being a human with another human. Yeah. And I've got to put aside that self-righteousness, and I've got to put aside that judgmental idea of like trying to get the speck out of your eye and just be a human for a second. Yeah. And that's the power of validation.
That's really good. So how do you know you're validating correctly? What are some of the things to prioritize when you're in a conversation like, oh, I should probably validate them? What should I do? How do I do it?
Yeah, the practice of it.
The practice of it, yeah.
I think it's once you're listening well. We talked about that in the last episode. You're listening. And again, this is intimidating because I'm definitely not an expert at this. And those who know me, if they're listening to this podcast, will be like, yeah, you've messed this one up before. And I do this probably more than I get it right, but I'm trying. And I think that's what we're all trying to do. Honestly, before you give feedback, pushback, correction, especially in the peer-to-peer relationships and even with, people that we lead, like our kids, for not the least of which, is validate where they're coming from. I mean, just simple statements like, man, that must be so hard.
Yeah.
Or, man, I just got to, you just want to make their experience valid. You are going through let me just say it, you're going through a really hard time. I can't imagine. I mean, what you're describing to me, man, I'm sorry you're going through that. And you're validating, you're making it valid. You're legitimizing, like, okay, if someone's validating my life experience, I don't feel absurd for feeling the way I feel or acting the way I'm acting. And thank you. Like, thank you for just being a fellow human. And even if I think what we default to in the practice of validation is just kind of the sweeping, oh yeah, I know how you feel. And you've probably had someone say that to you before, and it actually is more harm than good. 'Cause you're like, are you listening? I don't know that you are. And there is a reality there. I mean, even in Proverbs 14:10, it says, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy. In other words, like, in the end, no one fully knows another person's sorrow or joy, because there's just so much dimension to it. And so much, I mean, we can appreciate in general, usually if we've walked through something similar, but one person's journey through a particular sickness or a particular loss or a particular trial is just, one person loses their job, they feel certain things. Another person may feel the same things, but at different levels for different reasons. So we just can never say, oh yeah, I know how you feel. No, none of us can fully know another person's joy or sorrow, but we can do our best to enter in. And one of the ways that we do that is listen and at least try to give words back that validate. Man, that must be so hard. Or man, I know that from what you've shared with me, man, I know that this is a real challenge, and you feel like this, or I would imagine you must feel like this, or are you feeling like this and this? I mean, just giving that validation is so healing. And sometimes that's all the conversation needed. This is the point where we have all been in conversations where we needed validation. We may not have known that that's what we were looking for, but we just needed the validation. We just needed to know that we're not crazy. We just needed to know that we're not alone. And instead of validation, someone went into advisor mode, and it was so hurtful. And a lot of times it's like, I know the answers. I'm not coming to you because I don't know what to do. I'm coming to you because I don't want to feel alone. And when someone goes into advisor fix-it mode, why that's so hurtful is it's like, it makes me feel like you don't know me. Like you don't know that I know those answers. It's like, if someone is struggling with, they just, found out that they've got a bad health diagnosis, and maybe they're a mature believer, and you say, well, God's in control. They're like, I know.
That's not what I wanted to hear.
That's not what I wanted to hear. It's not what I needed to hear. I fully know God's in control. In fact, that's why I'm struggling. I'm struggling because God's in control and he's letting me suffer this. And I don't need you to fix it. And honestly, this is what Job, in the book of Job, and all of his friends, is what they miss. They're trying to fix it or explain it or blame Job if you've done this or maybe you should do that. And what they really just needed is someone to sit in it with him and say, this is terrible and I'm sorry. And this is beyond me, but I'm in it with you. That's why the practice of presence is so powerful. Like when someone's dealing with grief or loss or fear, just be there. There's nothing you can say that makes it better. Just the best thing you could do is weep with them, because when you're weeping next to them, you're validating their pain because you're weeping too. And it's suddenly the person's not alone. They feel understood. They feel not crazy. And then it helps them walk with someone through the pain. So validation it's powerful. It is fully entering into and trying to understand the pain of someone else.
That's good. So let's bring it together as far as linking empathy and validation. What would you say is the connection between the two?
Yeah, I think validation is a key expression of empathy. So listening is informing empathy. Validation is a key, maybe the expression of empathy. Because if empathy is entering into the experience of someone else, if empathy is feeling with them what they feel, validation is where you let that out. It's not just silently containing empathy. It's now you're expressing empathy. It's now the person you're empathizing with feels the empathy. So validation, in getting good at the skill of validation, again, not agreeing necessarily, but validating is an expression of empathy. It is where someone is expressing how they feel, their life experience, what they're walking through, and now I'm expressing back, man, it sounds like you feel like this, and they're like, yes. They're now experiencing the empathy. It's how I express it. If empathy is essentially the golden rule, I'm treating someone how I would want to be treated. That again necessitates I have self-awareness of how I want to be treated, and I'm now thinking through their experience. How would they want to be treated? Validation is now expressing that. Wow, I'm entering in with you on what you're experiencing, and I've already done the work of how would I feel? What would I do? I've already done all of that work. Now I'm expressing it back to that person. So validation is important for empathy because it expresses it.
Okay. So I feel like there's probably, hypothetically speaking, two people who may come across this podcast hearing about validation, its importance, and also how to apply it. How do you balance if there is someone who only ever wants validation but may need some hard truth?
Yeah.
Where they only go, I just want you to affirm and kind of just understand what I'm feeling, but I don't want to do anything to change anything.
Yeah, that is a really good question, and that's a tough one. And that takes, honestly, believers, it takes guidance from the Holy Spirit. And I think similar to listening, I think you always start with validation. You always start by trying to, like, again, not necessarily agreeing, but just, entering in as a human and trying to understand where they're coming from. And I think that then pushing out that self-righteous judgmentalism and just trying to do your best to validate. But there are scenarios where let's take it not from the person, but let's take it from the friend. There's some friends that only ever validate, and they feel like they're violating their friendship if they ever speak a hard truth to a friend. And there are times where, let's go back to the speeding illustration, Jeremy, where you might say, man, I have been there, but hey man, can I just give you some feedback? We've had this conversation 5 times. Seems like you're speeding a lot. You've gotten a lot of speeding tickets. Like, just because I love you, maybe consider, slowing down a little bit. So it's like, eventually there may need to be a place where you have tough love for that friend. That's part of being a good friend. So there are some people who your tendency is just going to be validate, thinking that's the only ever tool. And it's probably a tool to always start with. But at some point, you may need to share some tough love out of your love for that person. On the other side, there may be some friends that you're always in fix-it mode, and it's coming from probably a self-righteous place. It's coming from a place of like, well, if they would just always do what I would do, they would never be in trouble. And, it's hard. I think we all have that instinct. There's a reason why that plank and speck in the eye illustration kind of gets every one of us. We all struggle with that, and we have to intentionally push that away. But I think we also have to look in the mirror. If I'm always correcting and advising people and I'm never validating, I need to develop that skill, and I need to ask some tough questions about what's going on inside. And so when to apply that, it's hard to know. We need that. We need the guidance of the Holy Spirit. There are some people that we need to validate, but then give tough truth. And there's times that validation's all that was needed. So I think figuring that out under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, I don't know that there's a formula, but I think you're wise to surface that question, because I think we do deal with that as friends.
Yeah, every situation's different.
Yeah,
I mean, for the fix-it person, it's okay, maybe I need to lean into just getting into the mind of this person, understanding them and expressing them.
Yeah, and I would say a really hard point with that is as a parent. And as a parent, I don't want to just be standing over my child all the time, like directing and correcting all the time. Like, they need some validation. Sometimes there does need to be correction, but sometimes it's just like, hey man, hey buddy, hey sweetheart, I know I'm sure that was really hard.
Yeah.
So
there's a time and place.
Absolutely.
For both.
Absolutely.
So all in all, validation, it's getting into the experience of another individual and expressing that, understanding that.
Absolutely.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. We'll see you next time on the City Rev Life Podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life Podcast. Feel free to subscribe or leave a rate and review. If you want more content or additional resources, head to cityrev.org or download our app. We hope you have a great day.